Hello, you are listening to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and politics from an esoteric lens. My name is Andy, and I'll be your host. To receive extended episodes and support the show in the process, click the link in the show notes to subscribe. I'm offering a 30% discount on paid subscriptions. If you sign up this month, in the month of August, that discount will apply for an entire year. Okay, onward to the episode. Hello! Thank you everyone for being here. I'm recording this on August 5th, and Mercury has just stationed retrograde yesterday, August 4th. I thought this might be a nice moment to kind of go back and reconsider the work I've done and kind of make some connections perhaps between the work I have been doing in the past years and the work that I'm doing now. So I took some time to go back over some of my old blog posts, right? For many years I wrote astrology blog, and I selected a few quotes and parts of blogs that are very related to the kinds of things I want to explore in this podcast. I was even somewhat surprised, to be honest, about how I'm still mulling over the same themes that I've been mulling over for years. Like, it's the same questions, the same ideas, and this podcast is a way for me to delve into that in a more deep and concerted way. And so there's this sort of set of different themes that all feel very related. So some of the themes that came out when I went back through my old blog posts. First of all, I'm always interested in kind of understanding our moment in like a zoomed out, broad sense of where we are in time. And then from that perspective, I'm really interested in, as one of my favorite podcasters, Gordon White, always says, what is ours to do? I don't know if he gets that from somewhere else, so that might be someone else's quote, but I know it from Gordon White, whose podcast is Rune Soup. And he's always saying this, what is ours to do? And that's something I'm really, really interested in as well. In these times of change, what is ours to do? What is our work? What is our contribution? And like, if we want to create change, how do we do that? What actually is effective? How do we actually impact the world in a positive way? I think it's actually like a deceptively difficult question. You know, the most obvious answers, I think, are often wrong. You know, the ways we feel first inclined to react, which is usually a reaction rather than a response, I think sometimes that can actually make things worse. So, you know, this is sort of a constant question I'm asking. How do we participate in this world in a good way? And what is ours to do? And what's mine to do is going to be different from what anyone else's work is, right? Like, we all have a different way to contribute. You know, it might be something as simple as loving, right? Learning how to love better. That could be someone's purpose. Ask your heart, ask your soul, like, just try it. Just try this practice and just trust what arises. Try asking your heart if you don't already know, right? What is mine to do? And see what arises. It's often something very simple, right? I think the soul, the heart, they're very simple, which is not simplistic. Okay, so I was talking about themes that emerged from my writing, one of which is what is ours to do. Now, some more specific themes that I feel all have something to do with these bigger themes of trying to make sense of this period of time we find ourselves in and how we might relate to it. Our consciousness and science and paradigm shift, uncertainty and unknowingness as a way to approach or practice being in these turbulent times of change and paradigm shift. Paradigm shift itself, right? And its relationship to science, to spirituality, and courage and heart. So these are all themes that I want to keep exploring in further episodes. So I'm just going to read a few segments or selections from some of my past blogs that relate to these different themes as a way of kind of like celebrating the work I've already done and honoring this transition I am in. I'm posting the archive of my astrology blog, and it won't be available forever. That whole website is going to be taken down at some point. But for anyone who's interested in looking at the blog archive, I'm going to link that in the show notes. So I'm first going to read a blog that I wrote in 2022. I actually posted a link to this blog last week. Some of you may have already seen it, but it's so relevant to things I've been thinking about and want to keep exploring. So I thought I'd read this blog post first. And this one's actually on my Substack blog, not on my astrology blog. So this blog I called Empire and Consciousness, a New Spell. For millennia, there has been a structure emerging, coalescing, expanding. A structure of power and control. A colonizing, centralizing, totalizing force. We can see tyrants not as individuals hungry for power, but as pawns of something bigger. Even the tyrants have been used. Even they have been eaten up and spit back out. The force seeks power for power's sake, control for control's sake. It is not a person or group of people. It is a sort of being, a thought form, but more. A spirit, perhaps? A demon? A massive, snowballing, self-perpetuating automaton. A sort of selfish gene machine made of humans, not cells. Capital, not blood. Ideology, not skin. A conglomeration of matter, a self-perpetuating machination of bodies. Its survival and flourishing is a natural consequence of what it is. Everything about it merely functions to ensure its continuation, its expansion, its domination. And for no other reason it survives. It grows more massive, it spreads across the earth and reaches for beyond. I'll call it empire, though I'm not sure that's the right word. Empire has been carefully examined and studied by scholars, though usually in disconnected parts. One has grasp of a thumb, another beholds the knee. We know about structural oppression. We know that injustices flourish. We know that conflict of interest is not an anomaly but the rule. We know poverty isn't necessary. We know the game is rigged. Not everyone knows, but we know, you and I. And yet, despite our knowing, we live at a time when empire seeks expansion. No, it has expanded, but its lumbering, massive movements are only just beginning to be felt in human ways. It is not the mere corporation that takes advantage of disasters. That's an age-old tactic. The corps learned disaster capitalism from their forefathers named empire. So on the heels of a global crisis, a moment when humanity had all the opportunity in the world to regroup and restructure in ways that support people, instead we witness a mass expansion of empire, its tentacles reaching more deeply into our beings, seeking to pull us into its fold, like a demonic contortion of Mother, seeking what it has been working towards all this time, complete and total power over all of humanity and all of Earth. Over the coming years, the hardening, the usurping of human bodies and minds into this system of control will become impossible to deny. And that will be horrid, and it will be a blessing for when we finally see empire for what it is, when it emerges as a gestalt, when our perception shifts, we can't unsee it, when its slowly moving arms enfold not just the disenfranchised, but even the professional class, then the official narrative may change. And then we won't even need to fight. Empire will simply dissolve like the phantasm it is, for it is built of our bodies and our minds. And when we see that, all we need do is stop. Despite its inhumanity, empire operates as a spell, as always, using our own powers against us. Think of all that humanity will accomplish once it's no longer under the heels of such a force. So many have envisioned systems and philosophies that might save us. What if we don't need saving? What if we don't need some overarching system or bright new philosophy? What if simply by subtraction of the forces that keep us down, humanity will flourish? There's something I've been trying to write about for 20 years, since my time studying cognitive neuroscience and philosophy. For all this time, I've been ruminating on one particular problem, the problem of consciousness. Not that consciousness is a problem. The problem is that there's no way to make sense of it in mainstream scientific psychology. It's not just that the science of consciousness is new, or that its causal basis is not well understood. It's that quite literally, within the dominant framework, it shouldn't exist. This isn't my contention. This is something that many philosophers have pointed out. For example, Chalmers, Nagel, Bennett, and Hacking. This problem has led many of those who have grappled with it to reject the materialist paradigm that continues to reign. And yet, maybe in part because in our society, philosophers are generally given little respect, certainly not considered to have anything worthwhile to contribute to the sciences, science continues on within this paradigm that has been shown to be confused. But that can't be the only reason that so many scientists continue to operate within an outdated paradigm. Scientists aren't stupid, but they are human. Every human is subject to behaving in their own interest. Every human is subject to bias that favors their own survival and flourishing. Many such biases occur unconsciously. And empire impels us towards biased structures that invisibly operate in its favor. It's through science that we know about unconscious bias, and yet we seem to forget that it applies to scientists as well. My contention is that this reductive materialist paradigm in which there is no place for first-person experience, literally the one thing in existence we cannot deny, is an essential aspect of empire. All the force and power of empire bias the system such that this paradigm is favored, even though it's logically flawed. The simple pressures and banal requirements for funding and publication and tenure, all the structural elements of science these days subtly bias science toward materialism. This is an attempt at a beginning, an attempt at an overview of some ideas that I've been considering for many years but have struggled to express, an attempt to introduce some thoughts I hope to elaborate in the future. I'm trying to grasp the lay of the land. I'm attempting to convey what I see. It feels complicated and difficult in ways that are hard to explain. It feels heavy. Like there's such a weight to the dominant narrative. It has been presented as so reasonable, so logical. It has all the force of all our institutions, of industry and science, and all that is considered valid and worthy in this society. It has been presented as science itself, although we know that the science, right, is actually scientism and not science at all. It feels difficult because it's to call into question not just a particular line of reasoning, but an entire worldview, a paradigm, the whole damn thing. It's to call into question a world, which to those who live within it feels like the world. It's to call into question a way of life. It's difficult because it's in me, this world, and it's in most of us. It's the world in which I was raised and the world in which we live. It's fundamental to what has been called, quote unquote, Western. It is assumed in nearly every discipline, modality, practice, and profession, except those that are labeled fringe or condescendingly New Age, though even there it often creeps in. It's difficult for the reason that Kuhn noted in The Structure of Scientific Revolution. There is no way to reason oneself from one paradigm to another. There is no real communication between people operating in different paradigms. The shift to a new paradigm is all or nothing and all at once. It emerges as a gestalt, a new organization in which the data are more coherently explained. So how do we talk about it then? For so long, I stopped trying. I satisfied myself with simply, as best I could, operating in a different paradigm. One it feels like I've grappled and clawed my way towards, fighting against the intense gravitational pull of scientific materialism that has been so ingrained in me and in our society and in much of what most of us in this world take for granted. I thought that over time, scientific materialism would die out. I thought that the anomalies would accrue and scientists would no longer be able to ignore them. And just to note here, there are, of course, many scientists who see this and who are, operating in a different way and from a different paradigm. But still, most are not, right? I thought that maybe scientists would listen to philosophers. I thought that maybe people would see that our mental illnesses aren't caused by the brain alone. I thought that maybe people would see that the climate crisis and war and poverty and oppression are all amplified by the dominant paradigm. That social ills can't be solved with band-aids or policy hacks or a hot young politician. That a revolution in thought is required. There is a revolution of thought taking place. It has been taking place for a long time. Maybe it's been taking place for millennia. Maybe it's precisely the crux of the spiritual question. Kant and Steiner and James and Wittgenstein and Foucault were all in their own ways working on this. Not to mention the very many people simply operating in the new old world without the need to argue or fight the old current one. All those operating in spiritual and quote-unquote new age fields, and ordinary people who simply have no truck with what is dominant and conventional, and anyone unscathed by quote-unquote Western culture and colonization and global capitalism. And in this still new millennium, a new paradigm is coalescing, crystallizing, taking shape. No longer are the mystics lone wolves. The new, old, different way is here. And yet, far from fading away, we are now, just in the last couple years, well, now 4 years and more, witnessing a radical ramping up of scientific materialism. More than ever, this framework is tied to structures of power and control. More than ever, it is both supported by and supports in turn mass capital. More and more it organizes and orders us, justifying extraction of resources, both human and material, encroaching on all that is soulful and beautiful. Its threats aren't just conceptual. Its issues aren't confined to the laboratory. It threatens to be our end. So despite myself, despite the difficulty, the heaviness, the seeming impossibility of writing about such things, I feel compelled. Not because I have a new philosophy, not because I think I'll convince anyone, not because I hope to save the world, but because writing is medicine I need. And who knows, maybe it'll be medicine for someone else too. I do think that might be my best blog post. So the rest are not full posts, but just bits and pieces. So this from June 2021. Because the structure of mind is the frame through which we view the world, it can be difficult to extract ourselves from it, like a pair of glasses we can't remove. I mean, now I would say it's impossible to extract ourselves from it. Different frames of mind mean different assumptions, points of focus, filters, observations, experiences, and outcomes. Different cultural histories, perspectives, worldviews mean different understandings, knowledges, courses of action, and possibilities. We may not be able to simply remove the frame through which we filter the world, but we can see that it has enormous impact on us. It determines what information we attend to and what will be deemed irrelevant. It determines how we organize information. It is how we see, how we decide, how we act, how we are. History reveals the extent to which our worlds change over time. The way future generations see the world will be vastly different from how we see it now. It's just the way of it. There's no end to knowledge. It's not some final thing we arrive at. It's a function of culture, values, assumptions, goals, history, and so much more. And it evolves as we do. From our vantage point looking back, the evolution through new ways of understanding the world may seem inevitable or obvious. We take for granted that the Earth circles the sun and not the other way around. But when Galileo shared this theory publicly, he was tried by the Inquisition and found for heresy. There's always a connection between power and knowledge, not simply in that knowledge is power, but in that knowledge structures justify societal order. Knowledge as a worldview validates the ruling power, as, for example, in Galileo's time and place. The power of the Catholic Church was justified by its own worldview, in which its authority was unquestioned and as a result of Scripture. Any challenge to the dominant worldview also challenged the Church's rule, so any challenge was opposed fiercely. Isn't there something liberating in letting go of certainty? For isn't there always a possibility that we are wrong? Isn't certainty a sort of dangerous delusion? Dangerous, for certainty justifies much. Isn't there a humility in setting certainty aside? Certainty holds us to the past, whereas the future is unknown. The future is necessarily uncertain. So to create the future with freedom requires uncertainty, a sort of resting in uncertainty, being with not knowing until it doesn't even feel uncertain anymore. It is rather openness and possibility. To create the future with respectful relationality requires the humility that can only come from not knowing. Remember the magic of not knowing? From December 2019. We are living through the end of a world, and even among the relics and ruins, something new, not yet realizable, is emerging. We are building it without knowing what we are building, or in many cases, even that we are building. Our decisions now carry extra weight For we aren't just inhabiting a world, we're creating one. Aren't we being asked to say goodbye to what we knew in so many ways, on so many levels? The only way to a new world is through letting go of the old one and who we were within it. Now, I think this sort of unknowingness, we could say, is like a necessary step in this moment of transition. But I think it also comes with a sort of necessity of learning how to connect to our own inner knowing, which is different from conforming to like consensus reality, we could say. And I spoke about this a little bit in the Goddess Chaos episode. I made the distinction between knowledge and knowingness, where knowingness is about an inner sense of what is right and true, not necessarily in a theoretical or philosophical way, but in terms of our own life and our own decisions. Because, of course, maybe even more so in this period of change and tumult, we still need to make decisions, right? We still need to take action. So I think like it's almost like this uncertainty and an unknowingness, I think, go hand in hand with connecting with our own inner sense of self. Now, self in like a spiritual way is very different from ego. And I'm planning an episode that goes into this more deeply. I want to kind of really make this distinction and an argument for why I think there's a need for an understanding of selfhood, because, you know, some people have called this moment post-human. And there are ways in which, like, yes, we need to decenter the human and understand ourselves in the context of relationships with each other, but also with other beings, with the earth, with bacteria, and so on. So I'm all for this decentering of the human, but some people have taken this argument to a sort of further extreme of saying that there's no place for selfhood at all. And I mean, I think this is yet another instance of this like dialectical incompletion, right? Where we do need a critical analysis of what selfhood is. And I think sort of there's like a failure of the critique. And so people are going to this opposite extreme of just throwing out the self altogether. Okay, so just a little foreshadowing for an episode I want to create, which will go into this in a much more detailed way. But I'm saying all this now because I want to read a blog from September 2019 in which I spoke about this in a way, in the context of self-care. The internet may deliver a particular version of self-care, but the notion has deep roots. We probably wouldn't be talking about self-care were it not for people of color and feminists who spoke of self-care as a social justice practice in the 60s. So, for example, there's the famous Audre Lorde quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And yet, the roots of self-care extend back even further. In his series of lectures, The Hermeneutics of the Subject, Foucault argues that the idea that Greek philosophers were primarily interested in self-knowledge is inaccurate. We should better understand their preoccupation as with the care of the self, or the care of the soul. In other words, our current notion of ancient philosophy as primarily an intellectual exercise reflects our own focus or bias on mental life. But when we look carefully at the history, practices were at least as important as arguments. And the goal of such practices was spiritual knowledge. Such practices involve turning one's gaze within to analyze what is ethical, what is true, what is good. There have been different practices of self-care throughout history. One practice was to repeatedly imagine different possible iterations of one's death so as to be prepared for it. Another was to go through the events of the day at night so as to decide what was done well and where mistakes were made so that one might do better the next time. Another was to understand reading itself as a practice of meditation and dialogue as a practice to clarify ideas. The point I want to make is that practices we engage in here, such as my writing, or now speaking, and your reading or listening of these words, participate in an ancient history, as do the many practices that we engage in, from meditation to energy work to astrology to magic to therapy to journaling and so on. For all the faults of this culture extending from Greek and European thought, there are nonetheless threads of wisdom and spirituality that we might draw on as resources. And we might even use those very resources to reflexively analyze the traditions they derive from. That reflexive process is actually definitive of the tradition. We are not floating without ground in some New Age soup. There are roots, thick and deep, that we just need followed down a little beneath the surface to find life-giving wisdom and spiritual nourishment. I think many of us feel unrooted. Many of us no longer follow the traditions of our family. Religion no longer holds the place it once did, for many. And without that grounding, many of us feel untethered. And yet, even religions exist within a broader history of which we may be able to gather the disparate chords to understand ourselves as actually moored to something, or many things. Many interwoven spiritual traditions that our current history largely neglects. Esotericism, magic, alchemy, mystery schools, mystical religious traditions, witchcraft, ancient threads of shamanism, all these are still present with us and our culture and informs our practices. We are not making this stuff up out of nothing. We are supported by our invisible histories, by our ancestors, by the very culture that is also simultaneously so, quote unquote, problematic. Self-care isn't just what we do to mitigate oppression or survive in bleak times. For one, it fosters selfhood. Selfhood is bolstered or perhaps even created through the reflexive process of inner analysis. And that's kind of Foucault's point, that the self is actually created through these practices. The more we understand ourselves, our ethics, our values, options, desires, the more we open up pathways for living and responding according to our self with a capital S, even if those options are limited by the world we live in. The alternative is to act in the world according to what other people expect or want of us. Isn't self-care, then, an act of resistance? Doesn't it make possible acting in the world in ways that are not merely according to the powers that be? Those in power use all sorts of subtle tactics to control populations, including manipulation, coercion, and ideology. How will we resist these unless we have our own sense of what is right, what is desired, what is good? Without an inner sense of self, we will be blown about by external forces. It may not be some intentional conspiracy, but isn't it interesting that people will have you believe that selfhood is illusory, that we are just a collection of neurons and genes unthinkingly reacting to the environment? That philosophy is dangerously convenient for those who wish to have power over us. The notion that the soul does not exist is the most dangerous idea. We don't have to believe that the soul is some metaphysical thing in order to believe it. The most modest argument, soul is just what we mean when we talk about the experience music has on us, or the desire for freedom, or our dreams. Soul is how we understand ourselves and each other as human, as sacred, as subjects. Soul is how we know that other people have interior existences and feelings and hopes of their own. Erase that, and what do we have left? A world of automatons blindly doing what they are told? A justification for treating other beings as objects? No thanks. All this to say that self-care runs deeper than pedicures. When you engage in self-care, you are empowering yourselves and others to have more freedom and deeper interiority and more integrity. And I believe that makes the world a better place for you and for everyone else as well. Okay, finally, from April 2022. Despite so much talk and rising awareness about spiritual bypassing in the past years, I continue to believe that one of the most significant blocks for so many of us in our spiritual evolution is the tendency to look away from darkness. And I would now add not just darkness, but like difficulty, pain, tension. It's not only New Age hippies who sometimes get trapped in love and light, right? The false light that blinds us from reality. For reality always reveals itself in multicolor and many shades of light and shadow. It's the majority of humans who get trapped here without realizing it. It's not a conscious or intentional stance. It's a subtle resistance that most of us hold to acknowledging the ruthless and brutal aspects of human nature, both within our own hearts and in the world. And again, I would now make this a little more nuanced, where it's not just a recognition of what's brutal, but it's also a willingness to be with pain, right? To be with tension, to be with difficult emotions. So it's not always just about like a political thing of recognizing, realities of structures of power and control. It can be much, much more subtle. Okay, we might think it's actually definitive of spirituality to stay focused on what is good and uplifting. But while there's much to be said for taking responsibility for one's inner life and energetic state, acknowledging the shadow aspects of reality is not the same as fixating, ruminating, or focusing negatively. Our work is to acknowledge what is real and to hold it in a positive way, to bring light to the darkness, to bring love and compassion to the most horrifying and corrupt aspects of humanity, or to our own inner pain and discomfort. This is why, despite all the criticisms we could level at the term spiritual warrior, and many would be valid, it's also in some ways appropriate. This life isn't for everyone, a spiritual way of life, I mean. It's certainly not for the faint of heart. It requires courage and fierceness and stamina and vision. In an archetypal sense, I see the spiritual life as an evolution of the warrior, where the same courage and passion that was once directed towards protecting and fighting for what one loves and believes in is now directed toward fiercely holding love in the face of fear, compassion in the face of brutality, and for fighting through vision and frequency for what is true and good and just. It's not for everyone, and it's not for every time. You can't force a flower to open any more than you can force evolution, nor is evolution linear. We learn in cycles and spirals in our own rhythm with its own logic. For some, it'll be appropriate to bring light to the darkness. For others, they are working on and learning different things. There is no way nor need to evaluate where someone else is on their soul's journey. But I want you to know, fellow warriors, I write, I speak to you. I wish you faith and heart and courage. We are needed now, not necessarily in obvious or outward ways, but through just this, our capacity to hold love in our hearts, even while staring in the face of monsters. I think this theme of this last blog that I just read is going to become only more relevant over the coming year, 2024 into 2025. And I really don't think this is like only a leftist thing or only a right-wing thing. I think that humanity is moving through ripples of revelations, of realizations, of disclosures, we could even say, around the truth of the brutality of the systems that have been in control for a very long time. So this cuts across the political spectrum, and I think we will need this kind of courage and this kind of heart in the coming year. One thing I'm left with after reading these selections for my past blogs is that a lot of this feels very serious and heavy. And, especially we're now in Leo season. Leo is about play and fun and joy and the inner child and self-expression and creativity. And that's something I want to bring more of in an intentional way into this work, because I think that is so, so, so important. So, yeah, I'm just going to say that that's something I intend to weave in, hopefully, more. And I wish for you, especially in this month of Leo, that you can access some of that sense of play and joy, not just courage and heart and unknowingness and all these more serious things that we've been talking about, because they go hand in hand. The more serious our work is, the more we need fun and joy and laughter. So I wish that for you. Thank you so much, everyone, as always, for being here. Until next time.